Hello and welcome to Risk Chats. I'm your host, Paul Marshall. Today we speak with the Chief Risk Officer at the OCC, Bill Rowe. We're going to talk about how ERM got started there, how they're developing their risk appetite statement. Actually, it's already been developed. It's come out and it's been iterated a couple times. And just kind of what's the next steps for this agency and some of their unique mission. So without further ado, let's talk to Bill. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Very happy to have today with us Mr. Bill Rowe from the OCC. We're going to be talking about their risk management program. But first, let me introduce Tal, our co-host.
Good morning.
All right. So, Bill, good morning. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Paul and Tal. Good morning to you both.
Okay. Well, why don't we start off just a little bit about yourself and then about your agency. What makes you what unique risks you all may have over there?
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. It's a job that I've held since 2017. Technically speaking, I came into the OCC as a bank examiner and have had an interesting career there. The OCC is a federal bank regulator, which mission includes evaluating risks in the banks that we supervise. Now, it may be a little known fact that the OCC supervises almost 70% of the nation's commercial banking assets. And our mission goes all the way back to the Civil War, believe it or not, when Abraham Lincoln and various members of his cabinet saw the need to do two things. One, to establish a common form of currency for the United States, and two, to finance the Civil War. Now, we don't issue currency anymore, but we supervise banks. Our staff is charged with identifying and evaluating risks in the banks and executing supervisory strategies that focus on areas of higher risk in the institutions. Interestingly, that probably made the adoption of an enterprise risk management program in the OCC kind of a natural evolution in our thinking, because we were looking at risks in our institutions. So fine, let's look at the risks that affect our own enterprise.
Right.
Yeah.
So was it the financial crisis also one of those things that led you guys to think more about this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a very good segue. As a result of the financial crisis, the Comptroller of the Currency at that point was Mr. Tom Curry, who was also previously a board member over at the FDIC. He saw the need to have us take a look at ourselves to see what could we have done better through the financial crisis, and he commissioned a study by a group of international peer regulators, and we call it our peer review, international peer review. Out of that came a number of recommendations, one of which was to bolster our National Risk Committee, which looks at risks in the institutions, in the banking sector, but also to form an enterprise risk management group to look at ourselves.
On the overall mission and on the overall agency structure, were there any major changes after the financial crisis?
I would say no.
Okay.
Every comptroller brings in new
Sure.
ideas, so there are usually some organizational adjustments that occur as a result of that.
Yeah,
And
management focus, priorities, but no wholesale additions of mission by Congress or by Treasury. No new wholesale plug-in organizations to do the new mission.
Well, I would say the biggest thing that happened was the Office of Thrift Supervision was merged into the OCC as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act.
Right.
And responsibility for supervising federal savings associations was now part of the OCC mission. Right.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So I guess really the question is, who specifically, how did you get this thing going? Was it a top-down, bottom-up? I mean, were the executive folks really in support of this? Or?
Yeah, great question. It was absolutely a top-down initiative with the wholehearted support of the Comptroller, Mr. Curry, at the time, and a group was formulated to stand this thing up. And they did it. Started in about 2015. and it was fully operational by about 2016. Now, I'm the second chief risk officer,
Okay.
and I assumed that job in 2017. Mr. Otting, who is now the current comptroller of the currency, a former banker. It's interesting that one of the things that we, as an agency supervising our banks, encouraged banks to do was to set up a chief risk officer position.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a way, what we found was, hey, good for the goose is good for the gander.
Right.
And Mr. Otting was very supportive. I mean, he had such a program within the institutions that he oversaw as a chief executive,
Right.
and as now the head of the agency. He's very supportive of the enterprise risk management function.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that. Actually, a couple of those points I've heard a lot from the agencies that are doing this successfully is that it was really an executive decision. It was a very enthusiastic person at the top that made this thing really work. And
Well, if we're asking our banks to do it, why aren't we asking ourselves?
And that was number two, right? So
Right.
agencies that regulate or have these inherent risks for their grantees or their whatever, they're like, well, we got to do this too. And
Right.
IG's office is the same thing. You're hearing a lot of that now too.
Exactly.
Like the financial and the loan guarantees, those pieces of the federal agencies really do seem
Yeah.
to be out front.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, FSA was one of the first ones because all the student loan and all this huge portfolio, right? So it makes sense.
Right.
Well, and the other thing I think that we have in terms of support for this program is that the chief risk officer reports directly to the comptroller,
Right.
and is part of his executive management team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's got to be key to success right there.
Right.
So, something we thought we'd talk with you about. You guys have a great risk appetite statement, and it's still a little bit rare in the government for agencies to not only do them but publicize them. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how that all came about.
Well, thank you. That was, I think, a very interesting debate within the organization once we created our first risk appetite statement. I think it's become pretty clear to us that the statement itself is a very good foundation roadmap for the entire ERM program, and actually helps guide risk discussions at all levels of the agency, but especially at the top. It's a guardrail against which we measure our decisions, including strategic goals and initiatives. When it was first developed in 2016, there was this debate, as I mentioned, as to whether or not we should publish it externally. And I think the thought was, look, we ought to have some transparency on this and show people what we're doing, especially as a result of the fact that we had commissioned this international peer review. So the decision was made to make it publicly available, and I think we were probably one of the first, if maybe the only federal agency at the time that had done that.
There's an old ancient curse, may you live in interesting times. So that when you say it was an interesting debate, could you share a couple of points? Because really, I mean, the risk appetite is the least implemented portion of the standard federal ERM structure throughout the federal government.
Right.
So there are probably, if there is a conversation, they're probably all interesting. Can you share some of the interesting dynamics with
Well,
us?
let me just say it this way: words matter,
Right.
And what you put on paper is somewhat
Yeah.
cast in stone.
Yep.
So the wording was, very carefully looked at to make sure that it had the appropriate tone and tenor, and got the message across.
All right.
Yeah.
So what did you all take into consideration when you put this together? I mean, how did you really pick these areas, these categories? I mean, just kind of going back a little bit.
That's a very good question. I mean, we as a bank supervisor have a supervision by risk approach, and so we look at various risk categoriries within our banks, and so we realized that we needed to have risk categories that are impactful for the agency. And as a result of the stand-up, we came up with 9 risk categories. Don't ask me to rattle them off all now,
Right.
but they are on our risk appetite statement. And from there, we started fleshing out potential risks to the agency risk issues, risk concerns that fall underneath those risk definitions.
Right.
So the question is how do we do that?
And one question I would have, Bill, is you guys picked 9. And just like the wording was very specific and intentional, so would be these 9 categories. Sometimes you glue things together. Sometimes you break them out. Sometimes you don't put them on the list. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about, for other folks who are in the process of going through this.
Right.
What were some of the learning events that you had for identifying a function, combining a function, breaking one out, or leaving it off?
Well, I think one of the learning issues was that within, say, our risk categories and looking at kind of the things that might be a risk driver, there are some that we would consider, more important than others, and we kind of had to decide, all right, are we willing to accept maybe a high, moderate, or low level of risk in each of these categories? And we finally settled on mostly moderate and low. I think our discussion around low initially was, well, we want no risk. And that became kind of a debate because can you wring all of the risk out? Probably not.
Right.
There's always a level of residual risk after you apply risk controls. In terms of looking at a higher risk situation, that might be something where we'd be willing to take a little more risk for an opportunity.
Right.
That will pay benefits to the agency.
Now, when you were developing this, usually it would seem from what we have been experiencing that high risk statement is often the place where senior leaders say, I want to see substantial performance gains or something new, a cultural change in the way they've been doing business. Was that part of your conversation as you developed it?
I think so. Again, back to kind of the looking at the wording. I mean, we've kind of defined high risk now as a flexible approach with a higher possibility of failure. That's clearly something that could happen, but it may be also something where we're willing to tolerate certain uncertain outcomes to achieve mission goals and objectives, and willing to take a risk when there are long-term benefits that are foreseeable and outweigh the risks.
Right.
So it's kind of a trade-off. At this point, we don't have anything where we're willing to take
that risk posture.
Risk posture.
Risk. Right.
Exactly.
Well, so, and also, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's good that you have on here. Some things are, a lot of things are low, but a lot of things are moderate. I mean, there are no high, but there's a lot of moderate because, you've only got so many resources to deal with things, right? So it's impossible for everything to be super low appetite.
And then even within industry sectors, each industry sector is going to look different. Usually programmatic areas within an agency where it's a service orientation is usually where they're looking to take a more higher risk posture to get some gains.
Right.
If bankers are buttoned down, one would imagine their banking regulator agency might be at least as buttoned down in terms of as a culture and the mission sector of the industry.
Yeah. Indeed.
So let's turn a little bit here to talk about risk and strategy. I think some of the things you guys are doing there are very interesting, and I'd like to share that with our audience here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you guys approach that?
Well, our approach differs maybe from that of other agencies where risk and strategy are all in one unit. We separated the two, and that was a decision at the Comptroller's level, which made a lot of sense because I think you want to have the chief risk officer and ERM kind of as an independent view, and a separate strategy section to work to develop a strategic plan. Now, it was the Comptroller and the Executive Committee at OCC that developed our strategic plan, but we see a synergy, a need to integrate strategy and risk. I mean, as you're developing certain strategies, you want to have a gauge of what risks you might be taking to achieve that strategic objective,
right?
And whether or not it's outside of your risk appetite. I can tell you that I've been witness and participated in several debates about certain initiatives where, yes, the risk discussion comes up and is thoroughly wrung out. And in some cases, the decision is not to go forward with something because of the concern over a higher level of risk, which is, I think, what the whole idea of the risk appetite statement is to provide kind of a set of guardrails as to, are we getting a little off the road here and maybe going to run into the ditch? No, we don't want to do that.
OCC has strategic planning and strategic plan.
We do.
And so if it follows you guys follow the OMBA 11 standard framework?
Yes, we do.
So then with these obstacles and risks and opportunities that are listed in a strategic plan, right alongside a CBJ presentation where there's obstacles and challenges listed by each performance area, that you're saying use this risk appetite statement that shows the risk posture for each of these functional areas that are both in a strategic plan and then in the performance plans to say, does this correlate with our senior leaders' policy on risk posture?
We use the risk appetite to provide a gauge there, and as we evaluate performance under the strategic plan, the Enterprise Risk Management Group provides a view as to whether or not we remain within risk appetite and whether there are some things that we need to be mindful of as possible risks that as we're moving forward towards our objectives. I think one of the things that we want to see happen too, and we're working on this with our counterparts in the strategic planning area, is to continue to integrate risk and strategy. And I think eventually what we want to get to as well is, as we develop our budget for the coming year, we want to look at, all right, are there certain strategic initiatives that we want to put on the plate to deal with certain emerging risks, and what do we need to factor into our budget to deal with that?
Underneath your definitions, you actually talk for each risk posture about trade-offs. So obviously, you just talked about resource trade-offs. Are there other trade-offs that you intend in those definitions?
There obviously there are resource trade-offs. There are strategy trade-offs too. I mean,
right.
you in a way you might triage things and say, well, maybe this isn't something we need to do now because we should be attending
management
to
priorities and focuses and oversight efforts.
Right.
And gotcha.
Yeah.
So now I understand you guys do collaborate or meet a lot with other similar agencies, regulatory agencies. So what have you guys done in the nature of that? I think you guys have had some conferences and things to talk about risk with other similar agencies.
We have. We put together first and foremost, we put together a CRO group from the federal regulatory area, Fed, FDIC, CFTC, NCUA, ourselves. And that's been very interesting to kind of share concerns over areas of risk and how we are looking at our risk appetite statements. Several of them are in the process of developing risk appetite statements, so they're maybe not as far along as we are, which is, I think, helpful for all of us to share our experiences and how we're developing. I would say that in looking at this thing, not only participating with the Federal Regulatory Group, but also as a member of the Treasury CRO Council, common areas of risk. What are they? Cybersecurity, human capital, workforce planning, technology infrastructure, and obsolescence. Those are kind of three biggies that we're all dealing with in terms of managing risk and looking at strategies and objectives to achieve improved goals in those areas.
So this is very interesting. This is this CRO council essentially sort of like the CFO councils and other similar ones.
Exactly.
How often do you all come together and
Well, I think we've kind of set it as a every other month thing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now the strategy, we have another one that we've put together called the Strategy and Risk Group, which brought together the strategic planning folks, as well as chief risk officers or risk officers in a variety of agencies, mostly the federal regulatory agencies. And that has helped us have discussions about integrating strategy and risk. We had our inaugural one of those in the fall. We're going to do it. We agreed to do it every 6 months, so we've got another one coming up here soon.
Okay, yeah. Well, because I'm looking for some more podcast guests, so I have to call the group here.
Like you say the council members, many of them are developing risk appetite statements now. When did you initially develop the OCC statement, and how static has that policy been?
Right. Okay. So good question. The OCC statement kind of dates back to the stand-up in 2015, and the first one was issued in 2016. When I took the role here in 2017, I felt like it was time for us to do an update. However, we had a new comptroller coming in November of 2017, and it seemed to me to kind of time that after he got on board and got his feet down on the ground and settled into the OCC. So we actually started working on it in 2018. And in my conversations with him, it was very interesting. What we were thinking of doing another bottom-up risk evaluation where we go to our next level executives and sort of survey them on their views of risks to the enterprise. But in talking with the comptroller, he really wanted to understand where we were so we could learn where we need to be, which was then turned into a top-down assessment involving the comptroller and his executive management team, which was really worthwhile.
So you're just, when he says he wants to understand where he is so he has opportunity to determine where he wants to take the agency, you're saying the risk appetite statement is like an implementing tool to shape the management culture to make decisions at the agency? How is it a forward-looking policy implement?
What we wanted to understand at that point was what is the level of residual risk through our 9 risk categories.
Right.
Okay. So the assessment that was done at that point was basically a residual risk assessment. What's the level of residual risk? From there, the evaluation was, all right, what do we want to do about that level of residual risk?
And just real quick, Bill, when you say, for the listeners, what do you say assessing in the 9 different categories of residual risk? You, on a category by category basis, go through the identification and the assessment of probability and impact, and then examine the controls, and then say this, based on the controls, this is our residual assessment as at a detailed risk level for each category area. Is that what it was?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I think I have a couple more questions for you here. I'm interested to see what you guys are looking to do next for your program particularly, but also I think you guys are working some things in that council, like the maturity model. So maybe just those 2 areas, if you don't mind touching on.
So for our program, we're looking ahead to 2020. One of the things that we've been building out is our risk indicators. It's not really a balanced scorecard thing. It's a set of indicators that will inform our management as to where we might need to have a conversation if something is starting to push a little further out than we would like.
Right.
And I think it's really good thing to have. Initially, when the program was started, we had more of maybe a balanced scorecard approach to this, and we've kind of moved to a set of risk indicators that are key to each of the 9 risk categories.
Right.
So we're continuing to flesh them out. That is a challenging assignment.
Yes.
And I've had conversations with my FIREA counterparts about what are you all doing in this area,
Right.
and their answer is, I don't know. What are you doing?
What are you doing?
So that's the challenge. Is
Right. How do you measure how you're doing in a way?
do you have a profile that is a subset of the Dirty Dozen or something like that of actual specific risks that are considered high severity that you highlight as the agency profile?
We're looking very heavily at our human capital workforce planning area and have some indicators there with respect to the composition of our workforce and so forth and so on. Of course, what we do is examine banks, so clearly we want to make sure we have enough of those resources,
Right.
and continue to fill up the pipeline. So we're watching that very carefully. On the bank supervision side, what we're trying to develop there is a set of forward-looking indicators, and I think going back to the international peer review and the reason for that, looking at what happened during the crisis. Forward-looking risk indicators in the area of supervision risk are I think, critically important. You want to try and get ahead of the game and see if you can, as a federal regulator, turn the ship
Right.
to keep it in the right direction. Trying to think I think the other thing that you mentioned was the maturity model.
Yes.
And that is something that's been going on in dialogue with the ERM community of practice, which is a larger group than just the Treasury CRO Council. And when I say larger group, I'm talking 45 different agencies, Navy, DOD, NASA, us, bureaus from Treasury. It's a pretty big group.
Right.
And the IG is there too. The Council of IGs
Okay.
have a role in this. Looking at A123, which the OCC is not required to follow A123, but we do in spirit.
Right.
And I would say my comparator on the draft maturity model right now is that it's very similar to what's done with the FISMA maturity.
Cyberscope things,
Yes,
yeah.
right. Yeah. It's very, very similar. So you're looking at levels and where are you on that continuum.
Right.
There's a strategic management professional group. Often there's a performance management professional group that is separate from strategic management, and then a resource management group, which may be related but often similar, such you have these three stovepipes working together, but often stovepiped. And with the ERM implementation coming out in the last couple of years, what do you see, since we're talking about maturity models, how is it in your experience, and how would you foresee ERM helping integrate these functions and then the risk appetite statement that you have? How does that in particular maybe influence that?
Well, I would say that in the way I've approached the CRO program, and I think others have too, is that we work our way through the entire organization. We look at the organization broadly. We have, through our framework, set up points of contact with each of the lines of business, and that's kind of a way of tying everything together, so that we're not in a stovepiped situation, and everyone kind of has an idea of what's going on.
And you talked about you're using the risk appetite statement as guide rails for the strategic plan, make sure that the strategies have been selected for implementation align.
Correct.
And then on resource for budget, you're using it to see whether or not the budget decisions that are being made through that policy document are aligned with it. And on performance management, talking about leading indicators, and that a lot of your ERM issues that go into the scorecard come out of both mission and mission support indicators that would be in the performance management system.
Well, as I said, we're working closely with our budget people to get to the point where, as we develop our next budget, we start factoring in sort of strategic initiatives and areas where we want to address risk and assess, all right, how much do we need to set aside for in the budget for that particular initiative. And I think, I've had conversations with their chief financial officer and their deputy CFO, and we're all kind of agreed that, this is kind of where we want to get to, right? That's kind of one of the levels of maturity that we want to reach.
Well, Bill, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on to speak with our community, and sounds like you guys are doing a great job over there. So thanks for coming on.
And Paul, is there going to be a link for the appetite statement?
Yeah, we'll put a link up. Yeah,
and that way, if people want, and we maybe stick
along,
this at the beginning, right? They can pull it up, put it on the screen as they listen along, and see these categories and these definitions, which I think, guys, it's a great document.
Great, thank you both.
Thank you.
That's our show. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out at AFERM.org. All our podcasts are there. And we'll have many more coming soon, of course. So I hope you enjoyed the show. And until next time, this is Paul Marshall signing off for Risk Chats with AFERM.